So if this is your first time on the CG Fast Track website doing a tutorial, then this is going to be for you because this is going to help you save a lot of frustration, time, and energy along the way. The CG Fast Track format is different than standard video tutorials, and we're going to explain why. Standard video tutorials often leave you like this. This is a big emoji of me flipping over a table, right? So what happens naturally when you try to follow a video is you pull up your 3D software, you pull up the video, you hit play, and you try to follow along with the video. And that is an exhausting process for a number of reasons. Number one, it's difficult to process a video telling you what to do while you try to do it. It's kind of like reading a book while you're riding a bicycle. It's just kind of difficult to do. And it's also difficult to work at a pace that the instructor is in the video, which you might be able to get through some beginner ones that are pretty decent, but after you get to intermediate and advanced, it just becomes overwhelming. And what naturally happens is that it's easy to miss a step. And what happens is you constantly end up having to pause, rewind, find the button over and over and over and over again. And then you have to redo the entire process to figure out what you're doing wrong. And you end up rewatching days later, trying to remember how you did it, right? And this is an exhausting process. We've at CG Fast Track, we've been through this time and time again. And not only putting myself through the learning curve of all this different software to be able to work in the industry, but teaching hundreds of students that are now working in the industry, it's easy to feel like this panda bear where you just get frustrated and you just want to smash your computer, right? So the CG Fast Track format is designed to solve this problem. And it's simple, and it's incredibly simple. We just combine video and screenshots, and what that does is it creates an incredibly intuitive and fast learning curve. So what is this? How do I actually apply this? Well, one, you just sit back, relax, watch the video, open the screenshots, and then you click through each one and follow along step by step. And then you simply repeat for the next chapter. So on every step-by-step tutorial on the website, we'll have these screenshots. So you simply watch the video. Then at the very end, you'll see the screenshots, and you'll see the screenshots button right here. And then along each chapter, you'll see the screenshots as well. So you just click on the chapter screenshots when you're done, and then you use this to follow along. And essentially the way it works is very simple. You just click through and you can watch it like a video, or you can pause, do what you need to do, and then keep moving forward. Every step by step, every hotkey, every button, every node connection will all be right there. And then days later, when you need to remember what you need to do, it's easy to come in here and then just scrub through and find exactly what you need to do. And on top of that, whenever software is updated, it's easy for us to come in here and modify these screenshots whenever you need. We don't have to actually go through and re-record the entire thing. We just simply update the screenshot with the new version and the new button so you can continue to move forward. So this saves an incredible amount of time, frustration, and overall just energy trying to get through the learning curve. So this is where we're headed. We're going to get to the jet in a bit, but first I'm going to start with the basics. First project we're going to do is very, very, very basic. This is going to be a simple cause and effect. So a very, very simple cube hitting a cube. This will kind of get us warmed up, just familiar with keyframes and that kind of stuff. The next project that we're going to do is going to be this bouncing ball. We're going to get into the graph editor, how to work with Bezier and interpolation, keyframes and that kind of stuff. The third project we're going to do is going to be this turret. So this is going to be more procedural animation. So we're going to be mostly focusing on keyframe animation as we go. This will get into particles and constraints and that kind of stuff, just to give us an overview of those kind of things. And then the last project is going to be our jet sequence. So the first three projects are going to be pretty straightforward in the sense that, you can copy my settings, you can use my same transform values, those kind of things. This sequence is going to be certainly a challenge. It might look really, really complicated from a technical perspective. It's actually very simple from a technical perspective. The challenge for this one isn't going to be the technical side, it's going to be the artistic side. So it's going to take you a couple different times to do this. The first time you go through it, if you're new to animation, it's not going to look as flashy. It's going to look a little bit rough around the edges. That's totally fine. Just kind of get through it the best you can. And then the more times you try to recreate it, the more you practice, the more you'll get better. We're going to be working with the grayscale version. I am going to ship the texture version of the jet as well. So you have the models and everything. There'll be downloads below where you can get all that. I'm going to ship the sky plate, everything that you needed to create this exact sequence right here. And then afterwards, if you want to use the textured version, to do full-on renders and that kind of stuff. That's all going to be there for you. So one tip moving forward, I'm going to be using the render view a lot. If you're on a slower computer, try to stick in viewport shaded mode as much as possible. And then you can switch over to this to kind of see what you're doing. So this is how traditional animation is usually done. If you got a higher end graphics card, you can get away with just preview and Eevee. It's pretty fast. But if you don't have a higher end graphics card, it's going to definitely lag a bit. So try to stay in viewport shaded as much as possible. And yeah, we'll talk about animation roadmap in the next chapter. All right, so let's take a look at an animation roadmap. And we're going to learn smarter, not harder. So there's two main ways when you're animating. There's going to be keyframe animation, and then there's going to be dynamics. So keyframe animation is what we're primarily going to focus on in this course. We're getting into a little bit of dynamics, but mostly keyframes. So keyframes, you can think of them as just manual or snapshots in time. That's all we are. We're essentially just taking an object and saying, hey, be on this frame at this point in time. And from a learning curve perspective, the keyframe animation is going to be 80% artistic and then 20% technical. So it's basically going to be more practice equals more progression. There's not a lot of software training when it comes to keyframe animation. So dynamic simulations, particles, explosions, that kind of stuff, that's going to be the exact opposite in terms of learning curve. It's going to be 80% technical and then 20% artistic. So basically, the more training you do, the more you're going to progress. And then in terms of difficulty on this stuff, with keyframes, you really have a big stretch between difficulty. You know, doing very, very basic props, vehicles, those types of things are going to be more basic. But then there's a huge jump to characters. And this was a classic mistake that I know I made when I first started attempting to animate, is I just went straight to a character, started pushing around keyframes and not having any idea why I was struggling so bad. This is, you know, a decade-long learning curve to be able to get really, really good at characters. I know a lot of really, really talented character animators that essentially that's all they do. If you ask them to model, if you ask them to texture, they won't be able to do any of that kind of stuff. That's because they spend all of their time specializing in just character animation. It's highly, highly, highly specialized. With dynamics, you can basically break it up into two different layers. We're going to have single layered simulations and then multi-layered simulations. So single layered stuff is going to be like rain, fire, smoke, things that the simulation isn't interacting with other simulations, right? Some multi-layered simulations is going to be like explosions, destruction, disintegrations. You know, if you have a building collapse, for example, you're going to have all those rigid bodies, the actual geometry animating, and the geometry is going to drive like smoke and dust and debris. So that's going to be more multi-layered. With that said, Blender's really, really good, you know, modeling, texturing, shading, basic animation, that kind of stuff. When it comes to dynamics, however, it's, you know, Blender's really, really strong at the basics, just doing like very basic single layered simulations. Anything after that, Blender's going to really start to struggle. Programs like Houdini, this is what I always push people that are really, really into dynamic simulations to get into. There's a free personal learning edition, and even like the paid version is very, very cheap. There's an indie version that's only like $200 to $300. But the free version, you know, is fully capable. The limitations are very, very microscopic. So I highly recommend checking that out if you really get into the dynamic stuff. So if you're already familiar with the Lazy Viewport add-on, you may skip this chapter. If you're coming from the Sword in the Stone series, this may be familiar to you. Whenever I hit my standard G, R, S, and W hotkeys, you'll notice that they're switching to the viewport tools up here. The standard hotkeys look like this: G, R, and S. So this Lazy Viewport add-in is a preference. If you're already familiar with the standard hotkeys, please feel free to use those. I'll be working with this. If you're interested in this add-on, feel free to download it. Here's the address up here. Go ahead and just download the zip file right there. Once you get it downloaded, you can just simply extract it. And then as you navigate into the folder, there'll be a lazyviewport.py. Simply take that file, add it into your add-on. So I'll go to Preferences, Add-ons, Install. I'll navigate to the file, Install Add-on, and then just click that on. And whenever you have that on, then your hotkeys will be set up just like that. Again, this is a personal preference that I'll be using. Feel free to experiment and see what works best for you. There's no right or wrong way to move stuff around inside of Blender. And don't worry, if you use the standard transform tools, you will be able to follow along with the course just fine. All right, so this is where we're headed. We got a very, very basic cause and effect. We have a cube hitting a box. Very, very basic. There's going to be a couple challenges to get over, and we'll talk about those as we go. So I'm starting a fresh Blender scene, and we're going to look at our timeline down here. So you can think of timeline as simply as put as animation mode. And if I click play down here, we'll see that, okay, now we're essentially in animation mode. Nothing's going to happen, but there's a couple things I just want to point out before we get started. Up here at the top left, you'll see we have frames per second, 24. And then below it, we'll see what frame we're actively on. If we come over here to our output settings, this is where we're going to control frames per second. So this is going to be how many frames are in a given second. So 24 is going to be film, commercial, cinematics. And then if you're doing something like games, you're going to want to do 30 or 60. Typically, if you're going in engine, what you want to do is do 30 and then upres or interpolate in the engine itself. So most of the time you're going to be sticking with 24 or 30. For this entire course, we're going to be sticking with 24. And then over here, I'm going to go ahead and pause. Over here, we have start and end. I'm going to make this 1 and 72. So now essentially what we've just done is we've made our animation 3 seconds long. So 24 times 3, 72. So we still don't have any actually movement yet, right? So we're going to turn on auto key right here. And this is us creating a keyframe. And we don't have a keyframe yet. If we go over to our transform properties right here, we'll see all this is going to be grayed out. And essentially, as soon as we move this like this, boom, we have our first keyframe. So all this is going to turn yellow. And then we have our diamond right here. And that's going to be our first keyframe. And if we move our time slider like this, we can simply move it again, right? And now we have another keyframe. So as we scrub through here, we'll see that we have animation. Very, very basic. While we're on the frame that has a key, it's going to be yellow. And then anywhere that it doesn't have a key, it's going to be green. So this is really good. It's going to be a practice run. I would just move this around, play with scale, play with rotation, kind of get dirty. We're going to kind of clean this up in the next chapter. So play around. Now if I hit play, now we have our animation. Very basic. We'll want to get to know some hotkeys. So I have a hotkey cheat sheet. This is going to be in the starter kit download. The most common one is going to be spacebar right here. So spacebar is to start and stop the timeline. And then we have left and right arrow keys. This is going to scrub the timeline. And then we have up and down, which is going to jump to keyframes. And then we have shift left and right, which is going to jump back and forth to the end and start of the sequence. And that's it for now. We'll get into some more as we go for sure. But get to know those ones right now and you'll be good for this first couple chapters. And then if we kind of play around here, I'm going to show you guys the next problem that we're going to run into. If I simply try coming here to scale, you notice that our scale is going to be off, right? There's no way to actually just scale it on one axis. And now that brings us to orientation, which we're going to talk about next. So as we scrub through our timeline right here, we'll notice a couple different challenges. If we want to simply just rotate this object, we have to rotate it kind of at this awkward axis, right? If we want to scale it, it's going to be awkward too. So this is where orientation comes into play. And we can control our orientation right up here in the center right here where it says global. The main two ones that we're going to use is just global and local. So if we switch this over to local, you notice that our axis right here immediately changes. And if we just simply scale this like this, we now have our scale back to what we'd expect, back if it was at the origin, right? And the same thing with our rotation too. If we rotate now, we can see that's going to be much, much more predictable. If we scrub here, you can see it now it's going to be much, much more predictable. So global, local, those are going to be the main ones that we're going to use. So I just want to note really quick that we have essentially what looks like two different ways to do the same thing. If we look, we have transform orientation, and then over here we have transform orientation. So these are going to be the kind of like global settings, you can think of them. But these are strictly just meant to be working with the view tools over here. So for the most part, we're going to leave this default. And default is essentially going to revert to whatever we have over here. So no matter where we are, if we go to the center, the axis is going to be just like this. But if we also go all the way over here where it's awkward, and we can't really rotate, all we have to do is switch over to local. And then the hotkey to be able to rotate through these pretty quickly is just the comma key, so right next to M. If you just hold that, we can switch back and forth. So typically you just do global or local. I switch back and forth like this a lot, just using the comma key. So we may get into some of these other ones as we go, but we're primarily going to be sticking with the top two. So origin and pivot points. So if we notice that we have this little dot at the center of our object right here, that's going to be our origin or pivot point. Blender refers to this a lot as origin, but if you ever hear me say pivot point, that's going to be the same thing. Most applications call it pivot point, but I'll try to stick with origin as much as possible. And then if you notice, if we rotate this around like this, it's at the center, right? But this one up here, the pivot point or the origin is going to be at the top, right? So that's going to be what we're going to work on now. So before we get going, what I'm going to do is just select my cube here and then hit down over my time slider right here, hit A to select all, and then I'm going to hit X and then delete keyframes. And then what we're going to do is just kind of zero all of this out right here. And then 1, 1, 1, 1. So just setting all these back to the default settings. And then we'll just go ahead and set up the initial scene really quick. The Z is going to be 1 right here for our cube. And then I'm simply going to make a new cube right here. And then the values here are going to be 0.5 and 0.5 and then 10. And then I'm going to just simply move this up. About 11 is going to work for us on that one. And now what we want to do is move the pivot point of this to be at the top. So our cube down here is going to be fine for the most part. Up here, though, is where we have the problem. So to be able to control where this pivot point goes, what we're going to need to do is move our cursor at the top, and then we can tell it to do the pivot point wherever our cursor is at. So I'm going to go ahead and go into edit mode by hitting tab, and then go into my face selection right here. Select my face right there, and then simply go to mesh, go to snap, and what we're going to do is cursor to selected. And then bam, our cursor is going to be right there where our face is. We'll go into object mode. And now what we'll do is we'll go to object, we'll go to set origin, and then do origin to 3D cursor. So now when we rotate this around, we have our pivot point or origin right there at the top. And then we'll notice that we have a kind of a problem as we kind of test around right now. We're actually setting keyframes up. So what we're going to do is just before we actually rotate it around, just make sure we turn off auto key. And we'll get into manual keyframes next. So to get to our animation view, we'll just switch over to the tab right here. And then out of the box, there's a lot of really good setup right here. We have our camera. So we're always going to be animating to a camera for the most part. We have our 3D view to work in, and then we have our dope sheet. So the dope sheet is basically a more advanced version of the timeline. So we have timeline, dope sheet, and then graph editor. So timeline is going to be this, dope sheet's going to be next up, and then graph editor. And graph editor is what we're going to use for the bulk of the course, but we're going to stick with dope sheet for quite a bit. So first off, if we just kind of like play around, if you notice if I rotate around, our camera kind of gets stuck. To fix this, what we're going to do is I'm going to hit 0 on my number pad, or you can hit the tilde key and go to camera right there. And then I'm going to hit N, and then I'm simply going to go to view and then lock camera to view. And what that's going to do is make sure that when we rotate the camera is actually going with it. So we can actually control the position with our camera with our viewport. And just to kind of set this up a little bit, what I'm going to do is just move this over like this. And then what I'm going to do is when I got my mouse over the camera view, I'm going to hit home, which is going to just maximize that. And then we have our black bars up here. I'm just going to go ahead and set these to be completely black. That's kind of just a personal preference of mine. So if we select our camera, go to camera, and then we go down to, viewport display, and then we go over down here and we'll just set opacity all the way up to 1. So now basically we're essentially in a film camera mode. All the other properties that we want to kind of adjust in here, we have our clip start and end. You notice if I zoom out of this, cubes will disappear. That's going to be our clip start and end. So we're going to want to set this to something really, really high, something like 5,000. And I'm just going to zoom back in here. And then another one that we're going to want to play around with is just going to be focal length. I'm going to set this to 15. So this is just going to help exaggerate our animation. So a focal length of 15, whenever you have a really wide focal length like that, it kind of makes things look big, right? So longer focal lengths tend to make things look sleek. So like a model would be shot with a longer lens, something like a 90. And if you're looking at some kind of grand monster or skyscraper, you would use something like a 15. And then if we want to actually see our grid, and then before we move past this point, I'm going to just go ahead and drop in a plane and then go ahead and scale. And you'll notice that it's going to be at our cursor still. So what we're going to do is reset our cursor. I'm going to go ahead and undo out of that. And the hotkey to center our cursor is just going to be Shift C. So Shift C. And then our cursor is going to be reset right there. And then next time we create the plane, it'll automatically be set up to be at the origin right there. So I'm just going to scale this up like that. And then we're just going to set up a frame, something like this. If we look in our rendering mode, we'll see that we have some shadows going, which will help us animate too. I'm going to be switching back and forth between solid mode and rendered mode quite a bit. And then we'll take a look at the dope sheet in the next chapter. So the dope sheet, all this is a more advanced version of the timeline. And if we come back here, we can switch back and forth between timeline. We can do graph editor. We can do dope sheet. We're going to stick with the dope sheet for a while, but we'll eventually get to the graph editor. So I would definitely say, me personally, I use the graph editor most of the time. But as you get comfortable with the animation, dope sheet is a very, very simplified version of that. So what I'm going to do is select my cube right here. I'm going to go over to my frame 0. And then what I'm going to do is set a manual keyframe. So the next hotkey we'll want to get to know is just insert keyframe. And if we do that over our 3D view right here, we'll see that we get a little menu. And what we're going to do is just hit rotation. And then we'll do is go over to frame 90. And then we'll do the same thing. Mouse over the viewport, and then hit rotation. So it's not going to do anything right now because we haven't actually moved it. So we'll go over to our properties right now. And then what we'll do is in Y, we'll set this to -540. And you notice that it turns orange, right? So that means this keyframe has been adjusted, but it's not set yet. So if we actually move this around, you notice it goes back to whatever it was before. So orange means we have to force set the keyframe. So hit I and then do rotation. So this whole keyframe workflow right here, this is what I would say I primarily use. I don't use auto key a lot just because it gets sticky. You know, you're moving the camera around or the light or just general layout. It tends to stick and tends to be very problematic. So I'm definitely using the insert keyframe the most often. So if we hit play, we'll see that, okay, we got some basic animation, right? So why is this so different from the timeline that we already have been using? Well, it's because we have our channels over here. You notice we have all these different keys right here. If I expand this, we get even more, right? So let's break this down. It's mainly over here that we have to get to know. That's a little bit confusing when you get started because before we were just working with one keyframe. So basically, anything that's below here is our actual keyframe right there. Anything that's going to be above this is just a parent that has the keyframe because the child has the keyframe. So what I mean by that is this is going to be the child, and then all of these are going to be the parent. So object transforms, all these things don't actually hold the keyframes themselves. It's going to be our channel right down here, X, Y, and Z. And what's going to be powerful about this is that we now can move this stuff around individually. So if I just deselect right here, and now I can move individual keyframes around. So I can move my Z around, I can move my Y around, I can move my X around. So there's some other things too, like we can shut off animation, we can shut off the ability to edit it, we can lock it. Lots of really, really good stuff. So long story short, we can, for the most part, anything that's above these, we can just ignore, and then we'll simply go and modify these down right here. And in this specific case, since we only need Y, what we can actually do is come in here and get rid of the other ones. And we can do that by simply highlighting this, hitting X, and then delete keyframes. And then the same thing for Z. Highlight that, X, delete keyframes. So now we're working with a simplified version of this. And this is how I work a lot. the keyframes can get really, really complicated. And typically the less you have, the easier it is to control. So I tend to make sure I'm only working with what I need to at any given time. So to get going on our cube, you'll notice if we select the cube, all of a sudden we're missing all those keyframes, right? So as we select different objects, our dope sheet is going to change, right? So what we're going to do is kind of come right in here, right before this frame right here, somewhere right in here, and we're going to set a keyframe. So just before right there. And we're just going to hit I, and then location, and then I, and then rotation. And then what we're going to do is just move 30 frames over, and then we're going to set this all the way up to something like 84, and then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to move this down. So just go ahead and move down like this, and then rotate. Something like 100 and maybe 220 degrees, something right in there. So my exact values are right over here. And we'll have our orange, so we'll need to confirm our keyframe. So we'll hit I, location, I, rotation. So we now see our animation is actually outside of our sequence. So if we play like this, you'll notice that it doesn't actually play our full animation, right? So what we want to do is we're going to set our animation to start maybe 10 frames before. So we'll go to 44. So start frames 44. And then we'll do 10 frames after. So we're going to do 94. And now when we play, we'll see that we have our animation set up. But there's a problem here, our cube right here kind of does this weird slow start. We're going to want to fix that, and we're going to do that by using interpolation, which we'll talk about next. So to fix this weird slow start, we're going to need to get into keyframe interpolation. So this is a good bird's eye view of keyframe interpolation. We have three primary interpolation settings. We have linear, we have Bezier, and we have constant. So we'll just start with linear because that's going to be the easiest one to understand. Linear essentially doesn't have any slowdowns, any speeds up. It's just linear, right? So it's going to be kind of like a ping pong back and forth, right? Bezier, you can think of this as the ability to speed up and speed down, which is exactly what it's doing here. It's coming to a soft stop and a soft start. Then constant up here is going to be basically one or the other. There's no in-between frames at all. So if we look right here, each one of these cubes have the same exact keyframe. They just have different interpolations. So interpolations, you can think of the in-between frame. What are they doing when they go from one keyframe to the next, right? So what we're going to do here is come down to our dope sheet, hit A to select all the keyframes, and then right click interpolation mode, and then set this to linear. Now they're going to have a predictable fast start and fast stop. We're going to want to tweak the stop. So to gain more control over this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my dope sheet down here and hit home on the keyboard. And then what I'm going to do here is about 2/3 of the way through, maybe frame 74. What we're going to do is we're going to set another keyframe and then move this keyframe down so that there's a fast start and slow stop. So I'll just do I location, then I rotation. And then what I'll simply do is just simply move this down to frame 64. Now you see, okay, we have a fast stop or fast start, but now that movement is still going to be too abrupt, right? So what we want to do here is select these in between frames, right click, interpolation mode, and then Bezier. So now what that's going to say is, okay, start fast and then have a smooth transition to a stop. Very good. And then you can see it's starting to look very believable. We have a couple more tweaks to make, which is basically now we have a little bit of penetration issues happening. You can see a little penetration right there. So we're going to fix that in the next chapter. So the final tweaks we want to make here are simply to fix this penetration issues that we have here. And we can kind of, fix some of it on the cube. We can fix some of it on this cube right here. So what I'm going to do is simply kind of scrub through here and then go on to maybe like frame 58, and we can kind of judge it right here. But then we can just simply move these keyframes down a little bit. So we're moving them over to frame 61. So it's a little bit more of a faster start. And then on our cube up here, you notice that we won't see any keyframes. You can zoom in and out of the dope sheet just by doing middle mouse scroll. Or what we can do is just hit the home key. So I'm going to go to the frame right here, and I'm going to set another keyframe. So frame 55, I'm doing I rotation. And then what we'll do here is there's currently a slowdown on this. So it's coming to a slow stop right there, which is actually causing this to be a little bit too quick right here. So what we'll do is we'll select everything by hitting A, right click, and then do interpolation, and then linear. So now it's not going to be as aggressive coming through it. So it kind of starts there, still penetrating a little bit. So what we'll do is we'll simply grab those last keyframes and we'll kind of preview this on maybe like frame or maybe like 58. And then we'll simply just select these keyframes and then move this down a little bit like that. And we'll kind of scrub through here to make sure it's looking good. So essentially I just move those down. We'll just do like frame 99. Great, so that's looking awesome so far, and then we'll take a look at actually rendering this out in the next chapter.